27 years ago. Actually, it was this month, 27 years ago. Started one of the first online master's degree programs. We had in those early days, we had a 10-day residency required. And it was called the Master's in Holistic Education. And believe it or not, there was so much stuff attached to the word holistic that in year 3, I said, people come to this program with avoid it because of the word holistic, because they think it's something, I don't know what they thought, but it had a connotation of being maybe spiritual, maybe new age. That's it, new age. So I changed it to integrative. And we have offered 2 degrees, one a Master of Education in Integrative Learning, and the other in Montessori Integrative Learning. So I'm just going to start by sharing just a little bit with you and then opening it up. I want to respond right up front with the shortest answer I've heard to your question, Paul, about what is spirituality. So this past week, I had a wonderful opportunity to do a Zoom with Brian Swim. And I'll introduce Brian and Thomas Berry's work in a minute. But what he said was that spirituality, he said, simply put, spirituality is a sense of the whole. And that really came back to me in the roots of my work in Montessori, and also in my meetup with Brian Swim's work with his first book in '84, The Universe is a Green Dragon. I used that as the centerpiece of my lecture at a conference on peace and education the title of the lecture was The Cosmology of Peace, because he gave us the story of the new cosmology. And The Universe is a Green Dragon is really a dialogue that he had with Thomas Berry. He met Thomas Berry in the early 80s. He was a mathematical cosmologist. And he was searching for something more. And in Thomas Berry, he found somebody that was, Thomas is a cultural historian, a scholar, and a Jesuit priest, but he dedicated his work to the whole, and in that culminated with his last book, I think 2001, called The Great Work. And in that, he addresses 4 institutions that need to change to an ecocentric paradigm for the development of eco-human. And he talks about religion, politics, economy, and education. So taking a lead from that, I mentioned to Brian Swim, about how this new book of his, Cosmogenesis, really talks about the fact that spirituality is something that comes from an understanding of universal unfoldment. He said that Thomas Berry called the supernova the greatest spiritual moment in the history of the cosmos, because it was through the supernova that all of us are here. it created all the elements, and it demonstrates to one and all that we are all one. Everything is a unity, and ancient peoples, indigenous wisdom know that, but Western, other than Western mystics, it's been come through the mechanistic paradigm where education is parceled out, where the individual is an instructor of things and it's lost its verbness. I will say more as we go along, but it's not just the cosmic evolution that's important to embrace as we work with teachers in training. It's also the process we use in interacting with them and helping them in their own self-reflection of who they are. And that process is really akin to what Krishnamurti talked about and David Bohm, is the essence of dialogue. So really, if teacher education embodied a dialogue format, that could change a lot. I'll say more as we go along, but I thought let's leave it for other people to share their wisdom and how they have experienced this in your own teacher work, in your own self work, in your own teacher preparation work. How do you embrace the whole and embody yourself in the present, in knowing who you are? Self-reflection. I'll stop.
I'm called to share an experience I had in India when I went to visit Shibumi, which is a Krishnamurti school. And the presence that the teachers had with their students and how they started each day in awareness, in silence, and sitting together and noticing how even from a very young age, from 6 years old, they were involved in inquiry and dialogue. It became part of their routine. And by the time those students were 13, 14, 15 years old, they were having the most deep conversations that I've ever heard teenagers talk about. And along with that, as aspiring teachers and those who are trying to understand how do we do this, how do we understand this, my experience being there and witnessing this was life-changing. So those opportunities to actually see that it's happening, like you can do this, and what it looks like, I think reaffirmed for me that this is okay to do. Also, like it doesn't always have to be, especially when you're surrounded in a culture and a climate that is all about tests and information and content. I mean, even though I've had these experiences, I can feel myself getting pulled back toward, oh, but I should really do more content. I should really focus on this. And I have to keep bringing myself back. And so having those reminders is really helpful.
Thank you, Anne. I grapple with this question a lot because the self-development, the teacher development, the teacher preparation, it all goes together. And yet when I was overseas in Muslim countries for 10 years, there was no way I was going to talk about spirituality. I wasn't going to touch that. But I've found ways to be in relationship with students and building bridges and giving students more voice. Here at SOU, when I've chatted a few times with Ronnie Adams, she used that phrase, voice and choice. But it's more than just that. I'm realizing it has to do, when we talk about holding the space, but continually revisiting how are we inside ourselves, and how do we hold the space in relationship to others, and how I'm doing it right now with all of you is going to be different than when I have a class of 25 or 26 students. And I do have to remind myself, as Andrea was saying too, that reduce content and give more time for flow, transitions, interactions for the students, because that is all so important. And yet the students, we're all from mechanist. I mean, me as a student, I grew up in a public education system that didn't acknowledge me beyond the neck up. And Krishnamurti talks a lot about we're conditioned, and noticing our own conditioning is so important. And when you get in the flow of the head and not noticing the body and or just letting the emotions run you wild, which can happen too, it's always just that stopping and observing, who am I being right now? And going back to that. And for some reason, 20 years ago, when I started off on this path, I kept thinking I was going to get it. Like there'd be a point where, okay, I am this now. But that never happens. It's always learning. And it's always learning in relationship to a new group of people who are constantly bringing different things out in you. And how do I help support young people in bringing the best out in them, but not just the best, but also acknowledging things that are hard and difficult. We talked about that this morning in a group that Gianna was in. Because all of that is so important, and finding those moments that are not just in classrooms, making classrooms as comfortable, safe, wonderful as possible, but then also realizing learning is everywhere and we need to do it in all kinds of spaces. So yeah, and I feel blessed to have landed at SOU because I got to observe William Green for a whole term and sit back. I thought he'd be in today's session and start to realize there are things I can say and do that I never would have said and done in other spaces. But I feel safer here to be more experimental in approaching and integrating mindfulness activities and all kinds of things that I'm just learning how to do. I mean, Runga Run, there was a certain type of mindfulness within Runga Run, certainly. But every single place I go, I keep learning it in different ways. And I have observed a school at Brockwood Park in England once that was incredible. And going into those other spaces where other people are doing it as a whole community and observing the circles and it's more than respectfulness. It's like some deep commitment inside a whole group of individuals to be together in a relational way and to listen. And how that unfolds in each setting is so different. So just visiting Brockwood opened my eyes a long time ago when I first visited. But then it's so neat. And Paul, at some point, I want to come visit your school again. And Andrea and Cam, I want to come see your place. Because when I go places, I feel like I absorb a little bit more of all the different varieties of ways where our spiritual wholeness can be in relationship with others. I've said it.
I have like 35 things I want to say. One of those special places that I don't know if Andrea and Cam have made it to is the Rainbow Community School in Nashville. Have you guys been? So, they have an approach to education that they define as the, oh my gosh, now it's going to elude me. The, oh my gosh.
7 domains.
7 domains, thank you. And the 7 domains, including ecological awareness, including spiritual presence, including, the 7 sort of ways of being human, as they've defined it, is immersed in their teacher evaluations, in their student progress summaries, in their professional development work. It just shows up again and again, and particularly that realm of spirituality, that domain of spirituality is done so beautifully through the developmental journey of the child. So when observing there, for example, I noticed in the kindergarten class, they began so they have a centering exercise at the beginning of each day in every classroom. And the kindergartners, it was all sensorial, but it was done, like, for example, they had dipped cotton balls into essential oils or other fragrances like vanilla extract or something. And the kids closed their eyes, and the teacher brought around the tray and gave a scent as a gift to each student as a way to start their day. Was breathtaking. And you just could watch, because my eyes were open, you could watch the transformation on the face of these young children as they were greeted with peppermint versus, whatever, rosemary. And just the simplicity of that, and the tuning into what it means to be human. And then, of course, in the upper grades, it looked very, very different. But that's another one of those special places, Robin. I don't know if you made it there either. I'm also reminded of Young He's work with William and Fred Korthagen and the core reflections, and Robin mentioned listening. At TIES, there's observation as an integral part, not an add-on, but really an essential part of study, is to observe and to learn how to observe and listen deeply with full, or as Otto Scharmer would say, with presencing, as the goal. Generative listening, being fully with the living subject. And that strikes me as one maybe sort of leverage point in teacher education, because that's, I think, the ostensible talk today or chat today is about how do we cultivate spirituality within our educators, within our teachers. And I think learning to be present, to listen inward and externally, both, feels like a step that's needed and neglected typically.
When I first started working with my friend Scott Forbes, kind of as a mentor, and even still today, not just then, my brain would be going so fast, and he would just constantly say, wait, no, stop, listen to what I'm saying. And I think it feels like we think we know how to listen, and we think we know how to observe, and we forget that we have to keep learning those over and over, and that it comes maybe by slowing down our thoughts. And how do we help each other to realize that and to remind ourselves about that?
I think
Yeah,
just adding to that, when the thought is slowed down or suspended, creativity emerges. And I also wanted to add that the word spirituality has this kind of thing about it, just like the word peace. So it's not that we're teaching peace, it's not that they were teaching spirituality. It's the presence of who we are as adults with either children or adults that represents that ethos.
Yeah, I was just gonna, one of the things that came up in those questions that were sent out was kind of the quality of surprise or spontaneity, uncertainty, mystery. That I think comes in even what Robin was just saying about having to learn how to listen or how to be observant. And I think, at least for me, a lot of that comes through kind of an element of surprise, like, oh, I surprised myself, like, oh, I didn't know that quality of observation in this moment would lead toward this new teaching or this new learning. And I find it's one of my most valuable, tool or places of learning is to give space for that unknown whenever and however it might arise. And I've just been finding that element just so cherishable, because what I've been noticing is in those moments where I'm really able to let go and kind of steep into the uncertainty of the moment, or just let go of the preconditioning, let go of having control over what I'm going to say or the direction of the conversation, how in those moments, it's like afterwards, I almost find my world is kind of spinning a little bit. Like I'm having to reorient to a new way of being me. You know, it's like, wow, I just learned something really important and now I have to integrate this. And it's like, if I would have known what I was talking about, or if I would have had to have felt like I needed to, be certain of what I was going to say or the direction I was going to go, I don't think I ever would have got there. I never would have stumbled into that place. And yeah, I feel very fortunate to have, teachers and, the education, the background to be able to sit for Krishnamurti dialogue or, observation session with a group of people. I mean, I feel like even to be able to do that takes a lot of education, just to be able to sit and listen with the qualities that I think we even do here quite often. So just acknowledging, I think, my teachers on that one.
I appreciate you saying that. And I feel like it's important to acknowledge that, you had that experience and we can, have those experiences now. We feel like our learning is being formed by experiences that we're not always expecting. And I feel like it is important. And it kind of goes along what Philip was saying about, we're not teaching spirituality. We're not teaching peace. We're kind of embodying that a little bit. And I do feel like it is important to provide those moments for students and let them learn and let them form those amazing connections and have spontaneity and have, sometimes conversations, at least when I'm subbing, sometimes conversations during lessons will go completely off topic from what I was initially intending. And sometimes, we really need to reel it back in, but a lot of the times I'll just let it go and decide that what these students are wanting to discuss right now with each other and with me might be a little more important than some history lesson I am trying to teach them. And I do feel like I believe it's constructivism, but just the theory that, students are learning better through experiences instead of just passively receiving information. So we're not just pouring in things, but we're creating we're holding the space, creating a space where, important learning can be had through those experiences.
Hi, Kim. For me, as time goes on, that I am growing into the person and the being. I think I was wondering so many times about, what to do, what's ideal for maybe to show. But I realized more that it is about really deepening inward to become the person that I want to be. And couple of great teachers for me are, one is nature, the characteristics of nature, and just I had a luxury to be in the water, the very clear emerald, just green and blue and just clear water from the ground, and it becomes it becomes the river, and then we are on it, and then the water flows in different kind of streams and ways and corners and speed, and so being with being one with nature, I'm just getting more fascinated in what that truth might be for me. Another one is to really respecting the children's souls, their spirit, their curiosity and wonder, and very small things I probably would pass by without thinking, but they are curious and interested in small things like rocks and ants and the little dead leaf, and just so powerful reverence to nature, to what they see. They're just so innocently expressing their wonder through their observations. So I'm more hopeful for to believe that children are my teachers. And truly, if we could only become like a child, or being outdoors in nature, then maybe I'm one step closer to the truth that I'm seeking.
Thanks, Young-hee. Yeah, I also I did a little bit of homework for tonight, which included finding some of my old friends, my old books and articles and quotes and things. And one aspect of what you were talking about, Young-hee, reverence, came up a lot. And so this is from Ron Miller in his book, What Are Schools For? In 1990, he wrote, a basic premise of holistic education is the belief that our lives have a meaning and purpose greater than the mechanistic laws described by science and greater than the consensus consciousness of any one culture. Ultimately, a spiritual worldview is a reverence for life, an attitude of wonder and awe in the face of the transcendent source of our being. And I also appreciate that Ron brings up worldview, because as some of you know, I'm now really working a lot and closely with Four Arrows, whose focus, life focus and scholarship is all around worldview right now. And I think it's a good point that although our hope is that we can somehow cultivate, somehow teach this spiritual presencing, in our teacher education programs. It's not going to happen in a lesson or a certificate program, or even in a whole graduate school like SOU or TIES, as deeply committed as we are to holistic teaching and learning. It's a worldview shift, that needs to happen, that includes, exactly as you say, Young-hee, I think, embodying this connectedness, this oneness, this inseparability from nature, from non-living things as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. I'm reminded of the work that Neil Rogan did in Amazonia with the native people. And he was working with them. He made a video called The Amazing Universe. I think it came out sometime in the 90s. And he said, well, what can we do to help you? And their response was, you need to tell the story of everything to everyone. So back to that notion of the great story, that we are all one, that we came from a singular event, that everything is connected to everything else. It's a beautiful video for children and adults. Adults, no, he made it for adults, but I've shown it to lots of children and they're gobsmacked. And he interviews Brian Swim. He's part of it. So maybe I can ask a question about story, and it's not just the great story, but the presence of story in the classroom or in teacher education. Does it have a home from your experiences?
I learned so much from listening to stories, and I love to integrate more stories. But I find myself that maybe storytelling at the end of the term, or at the yeah, just once in a while when there's a little time left that I could do. So to me, sadly, it's not at the top of my like in my own classroom teaching.
Yeah, I find stories come more outside the classroom. Like this morning, I found a story coming up when I was sitting with Tim and Gianna and a whole group of students. But it was in a coffee house. And in the classroom, there's a lot, like there's content again, and things I want students to talk about and think about and notice. But how to integrate my own stories into that sometimes feels like self-centered, and so I don't do that as much. And there's so many stories and books I read, and then how to, it's like there's a flow of stories in relationship to people. But then in the classroom, it feels more structured and about activities and student sharing. But those are lots of little stories, but to have a bigger meta story, I sometimes think those would be helpful, and I don't always know which are the best stories, and I don't integrate it as much as I think it should be.
So let me just clarify. I wasn't so much talking about personal story, although that's important. I'm talking about stories that help young people and adults get a sense of how everything is integrated. Or I have a book on my shelf. We use it on a graduate program. It's a story, but it's a story for toddlers or young children, and it's called They All Saw a Cat. And it's profound because it really is the nature of observation and who is the observer and who's being observed. I mean, stories help learners think outside the box and see how things might be connected that they didn't see before. And I know the native tradition includes story. It's the way things are passed on. And we've lost that in our Western cultures.
Hi, Philip. I'm Kim. So Aya and I were present for a recent social emotional learning workshop where Ronnie Adams, Dr. Ronnie Adams at SRU, who does have the native perspective, spent an hour ostensibly telling story, breaking in the middle, inviting participation. And then when it was done, all of us sat around and went, what was that? And we actually had to look at it. And from a teaching point, since it was a social emotional learning workshop, you know, to get a micro-credential, from a teaching point, it was fascinating to watch what Ronnie had done. And two words apply here, I think, that have been mentioned on the call since I've been on. Thank you for letting me be late. One is when Young-hee said the word wonder. So did Paul in the quote. When we approach something with that openness of wonder, then it feels like we're actually able to, you're saying what we see, Philip, but we can see connection in different way. And no, I'm just going to stop there. Thanks.
I'm just following what Kim said because I was there too. The magic of the story by Ronnie just transforms us into a different world. But it's the teaching, you know, all this echoing and then resonating with the deep stories within each one of us, which is personal, but at the same time, universal at the same time. And it's striking the code so beautifully. Like as I'm talking, I'm still shivering, you know, that effect of the stories when it's brought up in a perfect way like that, it's just creating that human capacity to be there for each other. And then all of a sudden, just the space crack open and the magic happens. That itself was the wonder and the awe and then the magic. So, you know, all of us being there, like all the themes, the important teaching themes are emerging from the stories, like naturally. And then we couldn't stop sharing it. You know, it just came from this natural flow. Like, you know, he was talking about the water element. It was like the flow of things coming from the deep well of all of us. And it's just resonating each other. And then, you know, we just didn't know what happened. So we had to look back, and the same thing happened when I was part of this elder story circle, restoring circle from Alaska. Then for 4 days, all we did was just questions around, I forgot what, like four themes. And then 20 of us from all over the world just talked whatever came to us to talk and to share. And then the elders share the stories. And then it's just not crafted at all, but somehow deeply we resonate from that well, the deep well of our presence. And then when that happens, everybody transforms. And I had no idea what happened. I was crying the whole 4 days. It was just touching and, like resonating and reawakening the depth of whatever that was, the soul that wanted to come all the time. And then sometimes in situations like we are taught to be this way, that way, my wanting to become that way, this way in a square little framework just collapses in that moment. So that's the part of the story that I just recently experienced. Again and again, it happens. But in social emotional learning, micro-credential with Ronnie, we again witnessed that. And then the same thing which is happening here now too. Like there is something like deep inside of me which just wants to cry because it's just touching the beautiful well of presence, the deep well that connects us all. So that just came. Thank you.
I guess I'd like to say something that Thomas Berry said one time, in that film about the great, I think it was the film, The Great Story. But he doesn't know where to go from here to there. What at some point he's okay, so where do we go from here? What do I do next? And then he says, Father, Son, what shall I do? And Father, Son says, tell them the story. And then he says, Mother Moon, what shall I do? And Mother Moon says, well, tell them the story. And, what you all are saying, everybody's saying it, it's like built into us from way, 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 way back when, we can't even remember how far back it goes. When people started to use language. And that's what they did. They passed on, and that's how we pass on to future generations, the history. And I mean, the whole story of the universe is a story. It's a narrative. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. It is based on time, space. And so stories are wonderful, and they certainly do have a big place in the classroom. I really believe that. And they just emerge. Somebody mentioned the word emergence. It's what's happening, and it's what's happening here in dialogue. Things are emerging, and these things that are emerging are stories. I love that. I just love to hear all the things that you all are saying. I'm all ears. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I would like to quickly add to, I want to say I'm very thankful for everyone sharing. And as we were talking about how moving storytelling can be, it just makes me think about how powerful that storytelling and the ability to tell stories is, and how powerful that can be to give to our students. I have recently been reading a couple articles from Dr. I believe her name is Guanglia Li. She is a professor at Old Dominion University, and she talks about the importance of incorporating folk tales into curriculum. In her case, she was specifically talking about English language learners and the importance of that. And she was using it with Korean folk tales. But I think there's a lot to take away from that as well, not just for English language learners, but for storytelling in general. Giving a student the ability to express themselves in a pure form where it might be hard for them to say the story for what it's worth, but if they can incorporate it into making the characters into animals or making it more playful, I think it can be a really impactful way for a student to express their emotion, express their being, and achieve that whole and inner self, which I think is kind of what we were touching on earlier with that spirituality aspect of finding that settling into that wholeness. Yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
Just on a, I guess, more, I don't know, practical level in terms of where we see storytelling becoming pedagogically central in different approaches to education, I just would shout out the Steiner and Waldorf educators who use story as beginning in early childhood, but through the grades, as a really important way to develop what we would call thematic learning. And it you know, through story, they create rituals and festivals and all kinds. The thing about Steiner, though, is he has this burden of being rooted in his time and place and culture and Christianity. And it now, to go to a Waldorf school and see all the children reciting the verses of whatever saint that is, you know, whatever, it just doesn't feel, I don't know, appropriate anymore. And I would like to shout out, if those is for anyone who doesn't know, Beth Sutton and her work in developing Enki education, ENKI, which one way of conceiving of what she's done is to create a multicultural and diversely, richly traditioned contemporary updating of Steiner's incredible insights into child development. So also the pedagogy and curriculum is centered on story, but it's stories from all over the world, including indigenous cultures. So I recommend that for anyone who's wishing for a more packaged way to invite story in that touches on a lot of the Joseph Campbell universal archetypal kinds of, you know, what does it mean to be human elements that are touched by story. And then I would also say, and maybe particularly because of the reference to Alaska indigeneity, I have another colleague named Alarian Merkulieff, Larry Merkulieff, who's submitted a piece for the current Holistic Ed Review. He wrote a book called Stop Talking. And just as a counterpoint to the marvel of story is the marvel of silence.
In the class that I just did with Gianna and Stephanie called Teaching English Language Learners, the very beginning of that, I carried over what an instructor before me had been doing with creating just a really simple framework. I think it was based on Joseph Campbell's hero story. And asking 4 questions to the students to allow them to tell a story that is important to them from their own life, and digging into that in a way that they could really see the meaningfulness of it. But again, it wasn't by looking at that great bigger story of how we're all connected. It was just looking at student stories. And then this term, they created some really incredible stories. And the powerful part wasn't just writing it, but it's that it seemed to me, and Stephanie and Gianna could speak to this, but that it was the opportunity to read it out loud to your peers, and how important that sharing of the story, that part of it is. It's not just figuring it out, but it's the sharing process itself.
Definitely. I think that was such a lovely experience being able to do that. And it made me see how through these small stories from my fellow peers and fellow individuals, how their small stories can build into the greater story almost, and how through hearing what they have to say, we can relate to one another. And I think that sometimes can even just be the greater story of, we are all the same. We all can relate to something within each one's story. And I find that really beautiful in a lot of ways. And that's another reason why I really love storytelling, because there's always something that you can take away from a story in one way or another. And whether that's the main theme or a quote that someone says in their story, anything, I think is really cool. And that was my takeaway through that activity that Robin presented us in class, was that there's always something that we can learn from. So.
Now, how do we help students understand their own story? And maybe this is what you're speaking to a little bit, Stephanie, is how we can all find this, we can resonate with a story. Like, that's what makes stories, and maybe this great story especially, but it's so powerful, is we're all connected to it. And finding our own story and how it relates to this larger piece it helps make us feel connected when we can see ourselves, feel ourselves in a story. And as we're talking, and Paul brought up Steiner, and one of the best parts of my experience teaching kindergarten in Thailand was getting to learn how to do table stories, which were, in my opinion, one of the most sacred moments of our entire week, because there was this quiet, we begin with a song, and even in the song, I sing about how this tabletop is a sacred space, and we light a candle, and then the story emerges with little puppets and animals moving around the table, and there's so much there that's happening. But now in this conversation, I'm reflecting a lot on myself as the teacher in those moments, and my presence, and my whole spirit and presence changes when I do table stories. I settle into this place of reverence and connection to the students, and there's something that this energy, this kind of like bubble that just surrounds us, this warm glow around us. And just before this call, I was looking at a picture from a table story back in Thailand, so it just popped back into my head. And I thought to myself, looking at that picture, I said, it wasn't about the story, it was about that feeling that emerged while that story was being told. And I had to change. My whole presence really sunk in a different way in order to create that experience for my students. And after it's finished, everyone just has a different way of being. And that, for both the students and for me, was and still is so powerful.
Yeah, that that brings up this one, I don't know, I have a floating question of like whether storytelling and like being a storyteller is like a selfish thing. Like, cause you're like holding the energy of the group and you're like, I don't know. So there's a question I have. But I had a teacher that we had, an hour and 50-minute class, and all he would write down is like umbrella story or like the blue shoe story. And he would go up, sit in the front of the classroom, and for an hour and 50 minutes, totally wrap this room in just a story. And it was a psychopathology class. And he would just tell stories every single class. But those students didn't move a muscle. They just were glued and hooked. And I was just sit there, and sometimes he would tell the same story like a few times in the class, but it was still so potent that every time he told it, like no one said anything. No one like gave any yawns and it was so weird. Maybe it was just, being a storyteller is so beyond where I am right now and being, doing that. But it was very interesting. It was very interesting. And yeah, I'm glad I get to reflect on this now because I realized just how special that was in terms of teachers that I've come across.
Well, and I got to observe Andrea doing one of her table stories, and she was telling it from her perspective. I was kind of the bird's eye view behind watching the kids engage with it. And we're talking about 25 students, ages 3, 4, 5, and 6, a little bit of 6, but really little ones. And what you were saying, Cam, about Andrea was holding them. But they were you don't willingly get 3, 4, and 5-year-olds unless there's something special, not just about what you were saying, but who you were being. And it was like a mystery feeling that you were holding for all of us. And we got to be part of it by how you told the story. And the kids, it was so important to them to hear that story and to listen all the way through. And it was showing them that they could listen to a whole story. It was showing them so much about themselves. I don't even remember the particular story right now, even though I think I even wrote about it afterwards in one of my journals, but it was a long time ago now. But I remember the state of being of how you held that classroom. And it is a lot of power that the storyteller has. And I think you're right, Cam, to question it too.
Maybe it's not so much the storyteller that has the power, but the story itself. And the storyteller is just the conduit through which that story passes through. And that, I'm sorry, as you were speaking, Robin, I just was reminded of the mystery that's inherent in story. Is even when we do a story and when we do a table story, we start with everything covered and then we take the cloth off and the children see the different characters. But then throughout the story, there's this constant unfolding of mystery that's just inherent in every story. And that, as we already discussed, is certainly connected with that.
In this story, it's in you too, though. It's how you hold that story for the whole class so that they want to be with you in that story.
What many of you are saying reminds me of a phrase that Ram Dass used. And it was basically, don't teach, radiate. And so who we are, there's a radiation we hold. With some of it, it's bright, and some of it has been encased with conditioning. But every child or adult that we work with has this potential because it comes from the origins of the universe to radiate and to feel that. You've all been around people whose presence you just feel there's a vibration to. And we can cultivate in ourselves, not in an egocentric way, but in a way of really being who we are, authentic, with the people we work with. And you can even do it online. Paul, you're magical with that. I mean, just like your presence is just there. And I wanted to ask you something too about, don't you work with David Abrams' stuff from Spell of Essentials? Well, there's a storyteller.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. Lyrical language, and yeah, makes you feel the feels. Thank you, Phil. That's very humbling to hear from you. So because I did my homework, I have two more things in front of me that I wanted to share, and I know that Andrea and Cam are often very punctual with calling the end, so I don't mean to invoke that, but just in case we're coming near it, and since I was invited by Phil, I will share two things. One is part of a poem by Pablo Neruda that I'm going to put in the chat. And I'll also read it. And then I have one short quote by Parker Palmer. So Neruda wrote, "O irrevocable river of things, no one can say that I loved only fish, or the plants of the jungle and the field, that I loved only those things that leap and climb, desire and survive. It's not true. Many things conspired to tell me the whole story. Not only did they touch me or my hands touch them, they were so close that they were a part of my being. They were so alive with me that they lived half my life and will die half my death." And this book, The Heart of Learning, Stephen Glaser, is a lovely collection of essays on spirituality and education. It includes a piece by the Dalai Lama, Bell Hooks, John Gatto, as well as Ron Miller. And this is from Parker Palmer in that collection. And this, just a short quote, but it's one of my favorites. He wrote, "Education at its best, this profound human transaction called teaching and learning, is not just about getting information or getting a job. Education is about healing and wholeness. It is about empowerment, liberation, transcendence, about renewing the vitality of life. It is about finding and claiming ourselves and our place in the world."
Wow, that is profound and almost feels like a closure to me.